Welcome to the podcast, Jason Haglund. Jason is a fifth-generation farmer who has additionally cultivated his expertise through 2 decades of leading and navigating behavioral health organizations. Highlighting the rural realities, Jason's ability to navigate complex systems and connect with individuals has made him a trusted resource in the field. So welcome to the podcast, Jason.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited about our conversation. I just want to let the listeners know that I was introduced to you through our mutual friend, Renee Schulte, and we can just talk about what you guys are doing too in maybe this few minutes. And we also have other few things in common, such as farming. You're fifth generation. I didn't grow up on one, but introduced through uncles through farming, and then married a farmer. And we've been farming for, I don't know, almost 3 decades now. Well, at least I have. He's been doing it his whole life. But and we also work in the behavioral health field. I was a mental health therapist for about 20 years. So I'm really excited to see where our conversation goes. But
I am too,
before,
because it could go anywhere, right?
oh yeah, there's so many topics out there. We'll try to stay kind of on a general path, but you never know. So before we dive too much into the conversation, I just first want to give the listeners just a little bit more about you. So can you share a little bit more about who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Like many people, it's not a straight path, right? It kind of winds around a whole lot of different places. And so, although I grew up on a farm, was in 4-H, took pigs to the county fair every year, and for most of my life, helped my dad on the farm, coming home from college and grad school, and sneaking out after work on Friday night to go combine. Most of my life, I didn't go to school to be a farmer. Like you said, I've got a
Mhm.
graduate degree in counseling psychology. I'm a substance abuse counselor by trade. And so, like many farmers who are in multi-generational farms, not everyone sets out to do that. It kind of came back later in life for me, through a succession planning, of some things we had to do in our family to decide what we were going to do with that
Mhm.
farming tradition. And so my career was behavioral health, like you said, managing clinics and outpatient treatment facilities, working with kids, and adults through those difficult times, doing disaster response work. And then I started migrating to working with individuals in agriculture, and really focusing in on those areas. And lo and behold, here I am 8 years into farming with my brother-in-law, on our fifth generation farm, the same farm my ancestors settled on in 1886 when they came to this country as Swedish speaking Finns. So that's kind of an odd path, wouldn't you say?
I would say it's not general, maybe it is a general way of farmers these days getting there, especially if it's been in the family, but not in a direct path. But that's okay. But I bet so much of your experiences, can help you on the farm and also relating to other people. So, as a fifth generation farmer who has spent decades in the behavioral health system, how would you describe the mindset of rural America?
Yeah, and that's been really interesting, especially after the last few years, because when we
Mhm.
think about disaster and disaster response, I've done work with FEMA, and I've been to the floods. I've responded firsthand when those derechos came through our state. I've done follow-up after tornadoes, and the resilience of rural
Mhm.
America. I think of farmers and ranchers and everything they go through, but I think it's been really highlighted over the last couple of years, as we've all struggled with supply chain issues, just the extreme weather
Mhm.
events that have made so much more stress, in all of our operations across the board. And so, as we look at that resilience and we talk more about burnout, it makes me think a
Mhm.
lot about our farmers who don't have a choice, right? If you're a dairy farmer, you're out milking the cows, whether or not whether or not your employees show up or not.
Mhm.
And so in some of these occupations, you don't have you don't get to burn out, but it's still real, right? We're under this chronic ongoing stress. And so I've been talking a lot with folks about what are we doing for our rural communities to help support the people who live there.
So going off of that, like how do we support them? I mean, can you give us a couple things, one or two tips maybe? Because we got resilience in there. That's great. It's a great word, but the struggle, that we all face, no matter if we are, in the farming industry or not, we're all impacted by how the farmers do. So
Yeah.
what are two or three things that maybe can help people through or get to that resilience piece where they can get over the struggle?
Well, the first thing we have to do is talk about it, and that's something I'm out doing all the time, is having conversations because we haven't always talked about our emotional well-being
Mhm.
in rural areas, right? It's been that taboo topic of, you can't show that you might have something going on.
Mhm.
And that's been unfortunate because a lot of times we've hidden things in families, whether it's addiction or depression or anxiety. And we now know how common all of those things are, and it's a disease, just like a physical health disease. And so, as especially now as younger generations push us to talk about it more, some of the older generations and parents and grandparents have to get comfortable talking about that, some of those difficult topics. And so I think, when we think about what we can do more of, is talk openly about it. Talk within our communities about how can we support those around us that we know may be struggling, and not make it shameful, but
Mhm.
make it an embracing conversation.
Yeah. What would you suggest people actually start talking? And you said, emotional well-being, depression. I mean, sometimes those are like hard things to even start. So where do people start the conversation?
Yeah, and unfortunately, in the work I do a lot of trainings, I do a lot of the disaster work, and sometimes people don't start the conversation until after a
Mhm.
tragedy. And so I always, talk to people about, would you rather say depression or would you rather talk to someone after a suicide? Because let's be honest, ag-related industries and construction are two of the highest suicide rates in our country right now.
Mhm.
And so we have to talk about those difficult things, and we see tragedies in our own state right now as we think about mental health and suicide, and the conversations that every community, especially rural communities, need to have around those issues. And so, a lot of times it just comes with education, right?
Mhm.
If we really understand stigma, and we start to openly talk about, these are our own barriers of why we don't talk about it. And every room I've been, people come up to me afterwards and say, "Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Mhm.
I've been experiencing that. My kids have experienced that. But we didn't think we could talk to anybody about it." Well, lo and behold, their neighbors were experiencing the same things, but no one was talking about it.
Right. Right. There's so many resources out there, and especially these days, it's a little bit more openly talked about. I know that I've been to numerous farm conferences, and I can't believe the number of times when there's a topic about stress or the mental health of the farmers or the people that are the family around there, that those rooms are just packed. And so maybe depression is a hard word to even start with, but I feel like if we're talking about stress, it's a little bit easier to get the conversation going. Could I be wrong?
Sometimes it waters it down. And so
Yeah.
I always push back and say, let's just get to the heart of the issue. And, for the first time, rural healthcare, a study's done every year of what are the top needs of rural communities. And it's always been healthcare, right? It's always, do we have a local hospital? Do we have a local emergency room to go to? Iowa has 85 critical access hospitals all across our state because we feel safety knowing there's some place to go. For the first year, this year, those small communities said, we need access to substance use treatment and mental health treatment, even more so than just regular health care. And so that's never happened before. So we're really hearing people talk about it more and say, we need access in a way that we've never seen.
Mhm. And I'm starting to see how the hospitals are bringing in behavioral health and mental health care in the hospital setting or in the clinic setting. I just know here in Nebraska, in my small area, our hospital here in town has grown from 0 behavioral health to 2 or 3, and the neighboring communities as well are now voicing that they have mental health providers on staff in there for people to regularly see. So that is a good thing. That is a really good thing.
It
But
is absolutely a great thing. And when you think about those rural hospitals, they face a lot of challenges, right? And so I'm luckily doing some work over in Nebraska right now where we're helping your system along
Mhm.
in developing the resources they need to make sure they can meet everyone's needs. And I think that's the hard thing when we look at rural and frontier areas
Mhm.
is that telehealth, we have to think about other ways to connect. I saw a great online resource today that connects farmers with other farmers to support them. I think it was in
Mhm.
Wallace's Farmer today. And so that's when you know I'm a fifth generation farmer. When I'm quoting successful farming in Wallace's Farmer, then you know I've crossed over, right?
Well, don't worry. I just cleaned up the clutter in my house by getting rid of the last 2 months worth of Successful Farmer, Top Producer, all of those farm magazines that come at the beginning of the month. I had a pile about 2 feet high, so I decided it was time. It was starting to slide off the windowsill. So you talked about burnout and how farmers don't get that opportunity. I mean, the cows still need to be milked, the pigs still need to be fed. Like, there's chores to do every day, whether or not we feel like it, we want to get out of bed, or our help shows up or not. Can you talk into burnout just a little bit more and how they can work through that on their business, or anyone can?
Yeah, and I think we're at a tipping point right now older generations have been kind of all that pull your stuff up by your bootstraps. We just have to
Mhm.
go do it. Generation. Younger generations are a little better about setting boundaries. I have to say that my own kids are smarter than I was because they're able to say, you know what, you're paying me for 40 hours. I think I'm only going to work for 40 hours. I
That
don't
wasn't
think
an option when we were kids.
no, I spent half my career before I burned out working 60 or 70 hours a week as an executive. And for what? I don't know. And so I think about the wisdom I see of these kids, right? And so sometimes I hear people saying these kids are lazy, they don't want to work. Well, no, they're just a little smarter than we were, right? They know how to set boundaries, they know how to nurture their personal life, they know how to make healthy relationships. They're doing things that we didn't do that we didn't understand. And so when I think about burnout, I think about how do we bring the next generations onto the farm? How do we bring them on, understanding that farming and ranching, you don't get to set boundaries sometimes, right? When it's time to plant, you plant. And
Right.
when it's time to harvest, you harvest. And when it's time that the cows need you, you're there. And so there's a shift that we have to create, right? We have to figure out how do we make these things manageable. And that's not all going to be done through technology. Technology is making leaps and strides in
Mhm.
agricultural sectors of how we do things differently. But we have a very real workforce issue, right? And so we have to grapple with some of these things of how do we evolve
Mhm.
moving forward.
Yeah, gosh, my mind is going in different directions right now. And where do we want to get the conversation to go? First, loop around back to communication, because I feel like the burnout, the transition, there's a lot there to communicate. Obviously, you talked about the younger generation having a better sense of boundaries. They communicate that a little bit more. And having that balance, I think, between working so much and then that fun personal life. How does communication play a role in how to, I guess, state what the burnout is, or how to set those boundaries, depending on what side you're on?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, every part of communication, it takes someone to say it and someone to hear it. And so oftentimes we're not working in both. We're not willing to either hear what's being said to us or we're not willing to communicate in a way that's healthy
Mhm.
to the other party. And so, people call me all the time. I talk for Farm Bureau sometimes around succession planning. And
Mhm.
so I've been working with someone now for 6 months of how to talk to their brother about what's going to happen to the farm, right? And he still hasn't sent the letter. And so we're working on, how are we going to communicate your needs and wants and fears and hopes to your family? He's
Mhm.
seen his family at Christmas, at Thanksgiving, all the other holidays, right? But there's things we just can't talk about. And I think that happens in families, it happens in workplaces. And so we need to evaluate how do we create emotionally healthy space so we can communicate. And so it sounds easier than it is, right? Because we've all been in that family situation where this maybe it's just my family, but there's skeletons in my family's closet, right? Like there's stuff. And so,
And
we've
stuff
got to.
that sometimes we don't know about that been carried on through generations.
Right. Right. We don't even know why it's there anymore, but we were told you can't ever talk to that side of the family, no matter how far into the future it is, right? It could be 100 years back. So and so did something to someone else, and we're still holding that grudge.
We don't know what it is. We have absolutely, no date, time reference. What was it? But darn it, we have to keep that grudge. We can't talk to them. That does not create a great environment for succession planning for sure. And other things for family gatherings. Maybe we just don't see that side of the family. But the communication on the emotionally healthy space. So when I think about that, I think about, that 6 months and still haven't, talked to that person. Hard conversations are difficult. First, I feel like the person that has to state it has to be in that emotionally healthy space and are often scared, for the lack of a better word, of how the other person's going to respond. So communication takes two, but one has to initiate it. And how do we say it in a good, healthy way?
Yeah, and you've just defined the challenge of farmers and ranchers because so oftentimes it's our family members that are our business partners. And this is unique to what we do because we have that family emotion stuff that makes it more difficult to communicate, right? I
Mhm.
mean, I can use my own kids as an example, right? If someone else tells them to do something, they're fantastic and wonderful and giving, right? If I ask them to go scoop the sidewalk, I'll get to it, Dad, whenever, right? There's a difference in the relationship, right? And so this is something that none of us were prepared for when our businesses over the last 20 years became multi-million dollar operations, right? The price, the values, everything has gone up. And so as we think about now the average value of a family farm, which is actually a corporation, a
Mhm.
large scale business, and to treat that business and run it like a business, many people aren't were never educated, taught, or learned business principles to apply to that. And then your business partners, you don't get to choose, right? They're your family members. And so, I say that tongue in cheek, but I live that every day, right? I own a
Yeah.
business with my wife, my sister, and my brother-in-law,
Yeah.
right? We're the managing entity. And so we have to go have a business meeting once a year, right? We have an offsite annual meeting where we go over the nuts and the bolts, the down and the dirty, and we take a vote on if we're going to do this again for another year, right? Um, and it's very formal, right?
Right.
Because we have to do that as a business. And that's really difficult for some folks. And so that starts to set the stage for how do you communicate and how do you start to get your emotions in check so you can have those conversations in a way that you can be heard that isn't full of the emotion.
And you bring out such a good point because you have the, I guess I would say, a great benefit to having, like, say, your sister and your brother-in-law. Like for myself, it's my husband and I. Yeah. Like, and so we can have that annual meeting like anytime. We talk all the time, right? But it's that formality of we have to treat this as a business. And if this is, which it is, a multi-million dollar, business at these days, I don't think you can farm without it being that. And you actually have to do things a little bit differently, incorporating more of a business mindset, the corporation mindset, the annual shareholder meetings and all of that. But that's not something that any of our families probably demonstrated, modeled for us, because it was more of, it's not really a hobby farm, but the dollar amount was way less then. So how did people get these skills of
But
running a business?
absolutely. And I would say that most farmers, grandpa and great grandpa, they ran a really good business
They
because it wouldn't have
did.
gone on for, mine's fifth generations, and
Right.
they knew how to run a business. They knew how to make decisions. They knew how to pivot if they saw a problem in the market and needed to go, in a different direction. And so, I would challenge that. I think farmers have by necessity always had to been very good at business, very good at marketing grain, very good at looking at the cattle futures. Whatever market you're looking at, farmers kind of have to be generalists. They have to know all of these different things, and then figure it out with the tax man at the end of the year, because there's so many implications there, right? That's been going on for decades and decades as well. And
Right.
so,
Right.
a lot of those business principles have been there. We just haven't adopted some of the things that corporate America has done that's more rigid and standardized, right? And so I would
Yeah.
say your meetings with your husband, you should have 15 minutes every Monday where you talk business. And then that doesn't enter into the relationship the rest of the week, right? Because you need to have a formal set aside time. I didn't come
Right.
here to do family counseling, but I'm just going to let you know.
Right. Exactly. And, sometimes I feel very blessed to be in that counselor mental health position. Throughout my life, I felt like that played a good role for me to be able to manage. Okay, this is a business meeting. This isn't a personal meeting. How to say, hey, can we talk about that at another time? Because now is not the time or place. Having those kind of conversations. But you're right. I mean, we wouldn't have, your family wouldn't have been in that fifth generation. You wouldn't be in that fifth generation role without having, a great business model. It doesn't have to be as rigid as the corporate, but we do have to realize that there are those business aspects. We don't even realize they are business aspects. They're just part of what we do. So
That's
thank
absolutely
you.
correct.
But it's all about the conversation. So you also touched about technology, and farming is just so much different than it was decades ago with the upscale of the technology. I remember when we started with cabless tractor. It was a couple 560s. And that's what my husband's dad had. And that's what we started farming with. We have one left just for fun. But cabs, oh my gosh, what a transition. Now we have pivots instead of gravity fed irrigation. All of the technologies, we can do shutoffs, we can go on and on about the technology. But how has that somewhat helped us, but also maybe kind of made it a little more difficult?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's made it harder because unfortunately, we're very rigid, right? Farmers do what they've always done, and
Mhm.
so, in my situation, we do things really differently. And so my brother and I are probably pretty progressive in some of the things we did. So, just give an example, last spring, we like to follow science. We do tons of stuff around soil nutrient management. And we did some intercropping, which basically means we planted corn and soybeans at the same time and, 6-row strips across the field. We did an 80-acre trial. And literally, I had people stopping on the road when it was mid-season saying, "Were you guys drunk when you planted? Like, did you mean for that to look like that?" Right? Because it's so different.
Right.
And so you have to be able to put yourself out there because farmers, like, they look at your neighbors, they look across the fence and they go, "What's that going on over there?"
Mhm.
Right? And so we're kind of always putting ourselves out there. And so to push the status quo sometimes can be really challenging because there's a lot of pushback to keep things the same, to not be innovative. And we live in a time in agriculture when there's so much innovation, right? Things are
Mhm.
changing so rapidly. The way we do this, the way we follow the science, we have a lot of choices today. And so I think technology is just part of that, right? I
Right.
still have a John Deere A and a 4020, still sits on the auger, right? But I spend more time waiting for GPS signals and for software to boot up than I do doing mechanical work, right? It's
Right.
it's more
I
about
know. No, I get it because I don't literally do the production side of the farm. I take care of the books, but I hear all the time as it's like, yes, I've been sitting here for 20 minutes waiting for it to connect. And it's great when it works.
Absolutely. But I don't think we could go without it
Nope.
today, and I go back to, I listened to your episode about setting goals, right? And it made me think about setting yield goals, right? We set goals all the time as
Mhm.
farmers. And part of what makes farmers more resilient, to take us back to earlier in the
Mhm.
conversation, is that we set goals and oftentimes we don't make our goals, but
Yeah.
that's a success, right? Because I set really high yield goals every year. Unlike you, though, I have to wait for it to rain, right? I don't have pivots. I can't control the one thing I really want to control, right? So
Yeah,
I'm
but
in,
I'm
I'm
also
in,
still limited with the water that we can put on. So it's
well, I know, but all the high yield farmers will tell you, you got to have a pivot.
yes,
Um,
yes.
and so, I think about that, and I think about, we've gotten to be tough and resilient, as farmers and in agriculture, because sometimes we miss our goals, right? But
Mhm.
that's not, it's a loss that we take in stride, right? Because if we don't set goals and we don't miss them, then we're never going to come back and try to do it better the following year. And I think
Right.
that's something that we could teach other people, because so oftentimes people are so rejected if they don't make their goals. I'm all about failing all of the time. It wasn't until midlife I learned that failure is fantastic. I love to fail because it's the experience. I want the
Right.
experience to learn from it.
I think it does take until midlife because I recently have failure to me is the first attempt in trying and learning that often results in, needing some help. So yeah, it's like, why can't we teach kids that it's okay to fail? Because that's how we learn. I don't know. I'm still working on that one. But the resilience piece, because you're right, a lot of us are afraid to set goals because we are afraid to fail at them or not meet them for some reason. But there's many of us that set goals, farmers, they have an income goal, they have a break-even point they want to hit, and guess what? They don't have any control over that usually.
Right.
The the markets dictate that. I can't go to the elevator and say, "Hey, I need $6 corn today." They're not going to give it to me, especially if it's under four. So that's a part that, and farmers, like you said, it was like, "Oh, I need rain today." Nope. If I have a pivot, maybe if I have enough water,
Right.
or if my electricity works, or things like that. But they're very resilient because they're learning in order to go somewhere, we do have to make a goal. And then we learn in the process of achieving that or in the process of not quite achieving it. But if we don't set one, we're not going to go very far.
Right. And
So,
if we don't set it high enough, we're not going to push ourselves hard enough
oh
to
yeah,
really do
yeah,
more.
we can set a goal like I have a minimum goal. I'm going to exercise 10 to 15 minutes a day. Yeah.
Right.
And if I've done that for years and years and years, I'm not going to like my health isn't going to improve because I'm not stretching myself. So, what is your take on setting more like impossible goals or stretch goals or things that are like a little bit beyond our comfort zone?
I love it, right? Because that's the only way that's going to press us to innovation, and to really do things differently, right? And so whether I'm on the farm or in my personal life, I love to set those big audacious goals that maybe aren't achievable, right? Because if I don't ever set them, I'm never going to get there. I'm writing grants this week, which is the worst part of being a consultant, right? I'm writing RFPs, big statewide things, right? And sometimes I'm writing those and I'm like, we aren't a big enough company to get this, or we can't do this. I'm like, you know what? And I remember what I've told my business partners, I've told Renee this a million times. I'm like, we'll never get the grant we don't write.
Mhm.
We'll never get the one that we don't respond to and we don't try to get. And so, I just embraced that,
Mhm.
in everything that I do.
Yeah. That's a good mindset for a lot of people to have too, is you're not going to hit any target unless you go for it. And the ones actually that are stretching and feel a little bit impossible per se, I feel like are the most exciting ones.
I'll give you an example. I have a 0 in my birthday this year. It's coming up quickly. And so last year on spring break, our family goes with my best friend and his family. And so last year we went to a nice sunny place and we went spearfishing. And so we're all from Iowa, right? So we don't practice like how to dive down, how to hold our breath for a minute and 20 seconds, right? 20 feet underwater in salt water, right? I don't have a saltwater lake that's perfectly clear that I can go out right now and practice doing that, right? I didn't spear a single fish, right? Now, Was that a complete failure? Absolutely, right? We paid a guide, like everything we could do, right? But guess what? I had the best experience failing at spearfishing, right? There's nothing better than a snorkel on the reef. I can blame it was a bad reef. I can blame all of these things, right? And I'm going to go back on spring break this year and I'm going to fail again, probably, right? But the goal is to go and do it. And the goal is to go have that experience, right? Now, it's going to be way cooler story if I come back and say, look at this great fish I speared, right? Absolutely. I want the picture so bad. But I'm tempering that with, at my age, just to get underwater 20 feet and hold my breath for 10 seconds is probably going to be the win, because that's just the reality of it, right? I'm going into a completely different environment.
Mhm.
That's okay. Set a goal. And even if you fail, it's about the journey and the experience. It has nothing to do with catching a fish.
Right, right. And if we can just look at the big picture of it and look at the fun that we're having with it, about trying something new, instead of always focusing on the outcome,
Right.
I think we would have a little bit better mental health in a lot of different ways. And actually, we would probably go out and try new things more often.
Absolutely. And, and it's clouded because, when I do that, it's not going to be about the Facebook picture or the Insta picture or the TikTok I'm going to make about it, right? My kids are huge about this. They limited me many years ago. They said, Dad, quit taking selfies. I refuse to be in another selfie with you, which, I kind of need content sometimes. So it's a real struggle. But my kids, they're 18 and 20 now, and they're like, we don't care about that. Put away your phone. Let's just enjoy the moment, which again, I can learn something from my kids, right?
Right, right. They do, it's funny, but they are sharing probably some of the wisdom that we may have thrown back, thrown at them in years past, and they're recycling it in just a little bit different way. 'Cause
It doesn't mean I
probably
like
there's
it.
yeah, no, because I get that from my kids too. And I got a span of them. So it's, it's interesting from both ends, but they do learn a little bit from us and we do need to learn from them. And I've learned a lot. So, right. And do you have a couple tips on, how to manage some of that goal setting or changing our mindset in order to stretch ourselves to make more ambitious or audacious goals?
Well, we have to write them down, right? If it's not written and we don't reflect back on it, it never happens. And so the number one thing that we can do is write it down, hang it up, and come back to it, right? We need to review them at a minimum once every 3 months and check our progress, right? We have to have a measurable, right? We need to be measuring toward our progress, right? I just don't set a yield goal. Like, right now we're figuring out how much acres of corn and soybeans, what do we have
Mhm.
ordered, what's our nutrient management program going to be, we're going to hit this goal. No, I got to do a lot of stuff to reach my goal. I got to make sure I have 6 applications of so and so and so and so. I've got to
Mhm.
make sure I'm taking leaf samples every week so that I can see, am I going to have the nutrients I need to meet that yield goal, right? There's a whole lot of work from getting to point A to point B. And if we're not holding ourselves accountable and we're not checking in and we're not measuring our progress the whole way, it doesn't matter what your goal is, you're never even going to come close.
Oh yeah. And sometimes we have to remember why we wrote that goal in the first place. One is to write it down and review it often and check to see if our progress is making that goal happen. Sometimes we forget why we even wanted the goal and begin with. And that could even be a more motivating factor than, oh, that yield goal or any goal that we might have, a fitness or a health goal. Those tend to be great this time of the year. But the why? Why do you want a nice yield goal?
Well, it could have been the wrong goal because maybe I really just want to make sure I cover my costs, right? And I make some money, right? Because
Right.
if corn's only 3.95 next year, then I need a whole lot more of it. Right? So, why am I making the yield goal? And is it the right goal, or is my goal really something else, right?
Mhm.
And so partly, it's going to depend on what it is I'm trying to do. And maybe midway through I realize I made the wrong goal. I need to change it up. And this is really my goal. And so I'm going to move it to this.
And that's a great point because sometimes we make goals and we think we have to stick with it, even if it's not the right goal later, because we made the best decision we could at the time with the information that we had. But then you start working towards it and you realize maybe I need to shift a little bit. It's not exactly what it is. And in order for it to be what I want, maybe the why is different or there's a different variable in there. And that's what I should be focusing on. So thank you for that. All right, as we wrap up today, how do people get a hold of you? How do
Absolutely.
they find you?
Yeah, I mean, you can find me on any of the social media sites, but probably go to my website, Rural Policy Partners. And what we do there is public speaking, and consulting, a lot of systems work, right? I feel like
Mhm.
my impact can be made in helping to transform systems and legislation. And so, you'll often find me doing that really, what most people would say is really boring, detailed stuff, right? But I'm not doing that. I love to do public speaking and talk to people just like this,
Mhm.
because I think we can make these conversations and issues real, and we can talk about some really difficult things, but do it in a way that it doesn't have to be painful.
That's right. That's right. And I also want to bring up, we've mentioned Renee a couple times. Renee Schulte, you are co-hosting the Stepping In It podcast with her, which is a weekly discussion on the latest news and trends in behavioral health with practical tips and resources for improving the quality and access to behavioral health care. So if you liked some of Jason's thoughts on today's show, just check out him and Renee have a great conversation about various topics in behavioral health. I know recently you've done goal setting and achieving and decluttering, and we could spend a whole nother hour on decluttering, as we talked a little bit before we started this about how we're decluttering our, farm and our house and all those fun things. But I will put the links to how to get a hold of Jason in the show notes. And so as we wrap up, so is there one thought or quote that you would like to leave the listeners with today?
Absolutely. You told me to prepare for this, and guess what? I didn't do it. So spontaneously,
Good.
I think I think the quote that I would say would be, "Go for it." No matter what it is, what you want to do, don't talk yourself out of it. So oftentimes in the work I do as a consultant, the work that I do, across the different states I work in, is we hold ourselves back. And when we stop holding ourselves back and we make those huge goals that we think are unreachable, we never know what we're capable of unless we set ourselves free to do that. So go for it.
Awesome. So everyone this week, find one little mini goal that's part of a bigger goal and just go for it. Go make that hard conversation. Go write a letter to your brother or something that needs to have a conversation about a succession planning. Whatever it is, just go for it. So thank you for joining me today. Thank you for joining me, Jason. Been a wonderful conversation and hope to see you next week.